Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Content Drought Anonymous Club, otherwise known as a Warframe video. Now, as some of you may be aware, the recent 0.26 patch has dropped with the old blood, so you know what I thought would be a really brilliant idea was to do something completely opposite to anything related to that content and remake the Eidolon Part 1 video, because let's face it, the original one is rather unprofessional, and it was basically a VOD from me on Twitch doing whatever the hell I wanted and kind of recording it and just posting it on YouTube. So hey-ho, we're just going to remake it, and we're going to make it a little bit more professional, a little bit more to the point, and a bit more informative, hopefully. So we already have part 2, and we're kind of just making this first edition for the Eidolon guides to meet the standards of how we make our current guides. So if you want more of the in-depth analysis of frame usage, builds for frames, which weapons to use, how to build those weapons, that will be covered in the part 2 video, which there will be linked to in the description. So make sure you check that out before you start going on about me about how I didn't show many builds or how I didn't show you what weapons were amazing, although we will cover a general semantics of those. What to realize is the purpose of this video is to cover the base information that is as informative as possible while making it easy to understand. To reiterate, this video is for the purpose of a beginner's guide. So we will be initially covering all aspects needed for a beginner to get into Eidolons, or for someone who wants to touch up on areas they need to touch up on. And that does mean that we will be skipping out on what would be considered gimmicks. We're talking about things like using a limbo or Ivara with one-shotting limbs. We just want to make sure that the elements of this guide are what are going to be the most fundamentally useful for a beginner player. I don't want to be seeing comments down below going, well, you didn't show off the build for Ivara to one-shot limbs. I'm looking at you, elitist Billy. You can pull that elitist finger right out of your ass. So to make this easier to take in, we are going to compartmentalize this into segments, starting with setup. One of the key things to realize is that Eidolons are completely immune to frame abilities and status effects. So bringing caster frames like Mag, Ember, or Excalibur would be utterly useless. However, keep in mind you can in theory do Eidolons with any frame. These frames I'm going to mention are merely the ones that will do the job of helping your team the best, with the least amount of input. So in short, your team should be consistent of buff frames and one healer frame. The first player in your team will generally be a Trinity or an Oberon. You're looking for as much healing intensivity here as possible, and we'll cover more about the actual healing purposes later in the video. Then the other 3 people in your team should be one of the following 5 frames for a meta setup. Again, these are the ones that will give you the best results with the least amount of input. Starting with Rhino. Rhino is by far and away one of the best frames I could recommend for a new player to pick up Eidolons with, simply for the fact that he's very simple to play, very simple to understand, and has a lot of transparency with playstyle. He uses 2 to keep yourself alive, uses 3 to buff your team and yourself to increase damage, and not only that, but he'll keep himself alive with his active survivability as well. Very similar to Rhino, you have Chroma, who does almost exactly the same thing as Rhino, except his buffs are much stronger, and he doesn't have the invulnerability of his Iron Skin. But damage mitigation and bonus health are very useful. With Chroma, you'll be using his Vex armor to boost damage of your team to an exponential level. However, unlike Rhino, he is a little bit more convoluted to get the damage and buffing out of him. And then probably the least used frames out of the meta suggestions is Octavia. She is a decent frame to bring. She brings damage mitigation, multi-shot, and decent buffs to the team, and can shred Vombalists quite easily, which we'll talk about later. And then another pivotal frame to bring is Harrow. Harrow brings a massive crit buff, as well as status immunity, and is pretty much part of most meta setups, but can be substituted with certain other frames should you feel the need to. And the only frame that I would say is almost mandatory for any meta setup is Volt. Volt is one of the only frames in the game that can optimally buff your operators, and makes a damn good job of it as well. Additionally to that, his shields can then be used to buff your weapon damage when you decide to break the limb and kill the Eidolons themselves. Keeping in mind, for every shield you put down, you generate 50% electric damage plus 200% crit damage additionally. The electric damage is additive for each shield you put down, stacking up to 5 times, but the crit damage is not. So once you have your frames, you're then going to look at the weapons. Now, the weapons are a very subjective thing. In my recommendation, there are 7 meta weapons part of my list, but if you find there are weapons that you enjoy using, then please use those instead. This is just what I find works for me. So the two most suggested weapons that you'll hear in the general Eidolon hunting community is Rubico and Lanka. Rubico has a huge amount of default crit chance and is hit scan, so it's very quick, very punchy, and does the job it needs to. Then Lanka is the next weapon that you will look at. Lanka is stronger in terms of general damage. It's got default amounts of electric damage, which adds to the radiation, which is what the Eidolons are weak to. Although Lanka is slightly slower, it does have that default amount of electric damage, which adds to the radiation, which is what the Eidolons are weak to. And because it's slow and projectile based, it does mean you'll likely miss your shots if you're not careful, but it is still very powerful, and it's subjective as to which one you use. Now, outside of those two weapons, you'll look at using Arcoplasmor, Vectus Prime, Euphona Prime, Opticore, and Volcar Wraith. All of these weapons will work immensely well even without a Riven, but if you have a Riven for any of these weapons, make sure you use the one you have a Riven for, because the Riven will make the difference. Moving on to the next part, we're actually going to start looking at what you do when you get out onto the plains of Eidolon. One of the first things you're going to need to understand once you try to fight Eidolons are Eidolon Lers. Eidolon Lers are pivotal to an Eidolon encounter. Why do we need them though? Because these are used in order to actually capture the Eidolon. Now, an Eidolon has two ways of being destroyed. You either capture them or you kill them. Now, the way a capture works is very simple. All of the Eidolons have limbs. When a single limb is destroyed, the Eidolon will crumple to the ground like a bubbly baby bitch, and then he'll cause a radial explosion and try and teleport away. Now, what you want to do, if you have at least one fully charged Eidolon Lure nearby, this Eidolon Lure will tether the Eidolon and hold it in place. So having fully charged Eidolon Lures is pretty much mandatory if you intend on being optimal and capturing the Eidolon. If you do not capture the Eidolon, you physically cannot continue on from where you are, as capturing the Eidolon gives your team an item that allows you to summon the next Eidolon, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. So let's actually look at the Eidolon Lures themselves now. Eidolon Lures will spawn at Grineer camps around the map. They will generally always spawn in set locations, and you'll always find two Eidolon Lures at bigger camps and one at smaller camps. These Eidolon Lures can be shot at to take away their health and shields. They'll then enter a stunned state where you can then hack them, and then they'll start following you. What you need to do with these Eidolon Lures is to allow them to consume Vombalists. When an Eidolon Lure moves within 20 yards of a Vombalist, the Eidolon Lure will start tethering that Vombalist and slowly consume it over a period of time. Once the Vombalist has lost all of its health, it will then be consumed and add a charge. Assuming you have had 3 Vombalists be consumed by a single Eidolon Lure, then the Eidolon Lure will have its icon above its head glow blue, and then it'll be fully charged, allowing it to finally tether the Eidolon. Now, each Eidolon Lure can tether 2 limbs, so you'll need to keep an eye on how many limbs each Eidolon has, and then you can predetermine how many Eidolon Lures you need for each Eidolon. Just as a base example, the Terrorist, which is the first Eidolon, has 4 limbs, so you need 2 Eidolon Lures to capture it. It is generally a considered idea that you get your healer, usually your Trinity, to look after the Eidolon Lures and to collect additional Eidolon Lures as you go. Keeping in mind that every time an Eidolon is captured, the Eidolon Lures that are tethered to the Eidolon are destroyed, so you will need to keep replacing them as you go. So now you have your frame, you have your weapon, you know what the Eidolon Lures do. Now it's time to actually fight the Eidolon itself. Now we need to look at how we actually damage these bad boys. As you'll notice very quickly when you start fighting these guys, they do not take damage from general means when their shields are up. The way to deal damage to these shields is with your amp. Now, the first amp you get when you complete the Gara questline and the War Within is called the Moat Amp. These amps are able to deal damage to the shields, and you need to utilize these in order to progress. The better amp you use, the better you'll do. There are generally some meta builds, and I'm just going to cover some of the elements you want to look at here. We're not going to go into a deep dive of amps because we already have a guide on that, which there will be a link to down below. So definitely use that should you get the opportunity to. Realistically, if you have access to Fortuna, you'll be looking to use a X-2-3, the X being a choice of whatever prism you use, but the important bit with this is you're using the Schwaxen Scaffold and the Lorin Brace. Statistically, these are the best to use for Eidolons because of the crit ratio. Again, crit is important when it comes to dealing damage to the shields. If you have access to Fortuna, you will replace the Lorin Brace with the Certus Brace, giving yourself an X-27. The numbers, again, correlating to the component that you've put in there. Again, look at the amp guide, you'll get a better understanding for this. So once you have your amp, there are some things you can do to improve your amp damage. One of the most notable things is your focus tree. there are two focus trees which will give you beneficial damage to your amp. You have the Makari tree, which gives you Void Strike. Void Strike is a multiplicative buff that starts stacking when you crouch in operator mode. It's worth noting, however, that this buff is only generated when you leave your crouched mode. So if you start shooting whilst crouched, you won't actually benefit from the buff until you've left that stealth mode. This is then used in conjunction with Unaru. Unaru has a buff called the Unaru Wisp. This is picked up by somebody and using with Void Blast on an enemy or a limb of the Eidolon, it will generate a Void Wisp, or an Unaru Wisp, sorry. This Unaru Wisp can be picked up by anyone. The Unaru Wisp will give the person who picks it up 100% bonus damage to their operator. Using this in conjunction with Void Strike from Makari tree will allow you to up your damage from your operator exponentially. In an ideal situation, you generally want 3 people with Makari and 1 people with Unaru. That Unaru Wisp user will be generating as many Unaru Wisps as possible for your team, whilst the Makari users will be cycling through their stacks of Makari to boost their damage on the shields exponentially. Then there's 1 or 2 more things you can do to help optimize your damage here. The other thing are the arcanes. There are 3 arcanes that come from Cetus, which will give you bonus damage to your operator should you execute their mechanics correctly. You have Virtuous Strike, which is recommended as the beginner's arcane, as it doesn't require much micromanagement to make it work, as it just works when you strike the enemy, and it will generate a crit buff for your amp. This, because it's inconsistent, it means that you will just get this buff as you fight. Then you have Virtuous Fury, which is generally considered the most solo-friendly arcane, although it is still generally better than Strike, but, you know, it depends how much effort you want to put into actually making these proc. Then, statistically speaking, Virtuous Shadow has the highest possible damage output of any of the arcanes. The only downside about Virtuous Shadow is that it requires you to void dash yourself into the Eidolon's head, or to shoot the Eidolon's head to actually cause it to proc in the first place. So if you have the understanding of how Virtuous Shadow works, you definitely want to use this, especially in combination with some certain amp combinations. In fact, statistically speaking, one of the most potent amp combinations you can use is the X77. But this is only as potent as it can be should you have Virtuous Shadow, an Unaru Wisp user, and a good stack of a good stack of Makari with Void Strike. But for all intents and purposes, realistically, what you want to do here is use an X27, an X23, take an Arcane, and then combine this with Volt's Shield. As mentioned, Volt's Shield is great for your weapons as it stacks with electric damage and crit damage. You can only make use of 1 shield with your operator, however. What we're going to do now is we're going to quickly explain how the fight of an Eidolon works. Now, all of the Eidolons are exactly the same in terms of execution, so there's no point trying to go into the detail of how to kill each one of them, because it's the same across the board. They just have certain different abilities that you'll need to watch out for, which we'll cover in a moment. So once the shields go down after you've dealt enough damage with your amp, you'll be able to attack one of the radiator-looking components that connect the limbs together. These things are durable, so this is where your setup of damage comes into play. Once you use your mighty powers to destroy a limb, the Eidolon crumples to the ground and lets out a wave of magnetic damage. If you're struck by this, you'll die. However, as with all types of damage the Eidolons deal, you can avoid this by crouching in operator mode. The only damage you cannot avoid by crouching in operator mode from Eidolons is magnetic or physical-based damage, so don't get stood on. As a disclaimer, you can't destroy more than 1 limb at a time, as much as we would really like to. So this is where the Eidolon Lers come into play. Once the shield goes down and once the limb is destroyed, as mentioned earlier with the Eidolon Lure explanation, a Eidolon Lure that is fully charged will then tether that limb. The Eidolon Lure will then be held in place and prevented from running away. If you don't have a fully charged Eidolon Lure, the Eidolon will teleport away, regenerating all of its shields, and then you'll have to go chasing it down and wasting time. Once the Eidolon has stood back up from its little crybaby mode, it's just a simple case of rinse and repeating on the other limbs, and once that's done, the Eidolon then goes into phase 2, which consists of the Eidolon crying like a bubbly baby bitch again about how unfair life is and how much he's being bullied by a bunch of random Tenno, and this phase then lasts for 45 seconds. During that 45 seconds, the Eidolon will be summoning Vombalists that will dart towards it, recharging its shields for every Vombalist that does actually get to the Eidolon. Each Vombalist that is consumed will recharge 5 to 10% of its overall shield battery. So, you know, don't let them reach it, question mark? This also does give you the opportunity of fully charging your Eidolon Lures if you haven't already. Additionally, this is also the phase that your Eidolon Lure carrier should run off and go and grab a couple extra Lures for the next Eidolon. Once this crybaby phase ends, the Eidolon stands back up and is finally killable. It is at this point you need to 100% make sure you have all the limbs tethered, as even one single limb untethered will mean the Eidolon dies, and you can't continue. But assuming you have all the limbs tethered, then the Eidolon will be captured, and once captured, it will drop a brilliant Eidolon shard, which means each one of your players will need one of these Eidolon shards and pick it up in order to summon the next Eidolon. You'll take these Eidolon shards to the fountain in the middle of the lake, and you need to make sure you do this, because if you don't, then the next Eidolon doesn't summon. The difference between a kill and a capture is quite simple. A kill is denoted by the Eidolon sounding like it's just stubbed its toe and then collapsing to the ground in a clump and slowly dissolving. A capture is when the Eidolon ascends into the sky like a dainty princess and is then eaten by a big glowy blue glow on the ground and is not then seen again. It is important to realize that capturing the Eidolon is simpler, quicker, easier, and gives you beneficial loot. You have much more items you get when you capture the Eidolon as opposed to just killing it. But if all you care about is sentient cores, then killing Eidolons is fine as well. But if you're looking to go for the Hydralist, you must capture. And that's it! The next two Eidolons are fought in the exact same manner. You just make sure you have the extra Eidolon Lers to cover the extra limbs. You'll be dealing with extra health, extra shields, which is just overcome by optimizing your setup slightly. You'll deal with their slightly different mechanics in terms of abilities, and we'll cover those abilities in a moment when we go through each individual Eidolon and what to look out for. Really, this sounds like a lot of waffle, but you can summarize all the Eidolons in the following 7 steps. 1. Setup is key. 2. Don't stand in the stupid, because if you stand in the stupid, you're stupid, so don't stand in the stupid! 3. Get Eidolon Lers. 4. Destroy the shields. 5. Destroy the limbs. 6. Rinse and repeat. 7. Capture. And additionally, 8. Yeah, there's another one. Don't stand in the stupid! And last but not least, let's take a quick look at the actual Eidolons individually and see what they do. The Tridolon is the introductory Eidolon. There is no majorly difficult ability this guy has. All of his abilities are very easily telegraphed, very obvious that they're going to damage you, so again, don't stand in the stupid. However, there are 2 abilities that all 3 of the Eidolons share in common, and you want to keep an eye on these. The first main ability is the Shield Recharge. This is an ability that is on a timer, and every now and again, the Eidolon will glow blue, scream out loud about how much he loves Justin Bieber, and then he'll tether nearby Vombalists. The more Vombalists he tethers, the quicker the shields will recharge. He will additionally become completely immune to damage until the Vombalists have been dealt with. So the idea here is, you kill the Vombalists, you take down the shields it regenerates, and you continue on like normal. One thing to note, however, is that when an Eidolon does recharge its shields, one of its abilities will change ever so slightly. The Terrorist, for all intents and purposes, doesn't do anything different. He just recharges his shields. The second ability they share in common is the Magnetic Pulse, and this is the ability that will kick you in the scrotum if you get hit by it. If you are struck by the Magnetic Pulse, you will lose all your shields and all your energy, which is why bringing energy plates can be quite useful sometimes. But this is something that can be quite easily mitigated in a couple of different ways. You can either bring a Harrow or an Oberon, both of which have the ability of nullifying this completely. Or if you've killed a few Eidolons before, you can bring Arcane Nullifier. But keep in mind, even with 2 fully leveled Arcane Nullifiers, you're not going to get complete immunity, but it does give you a very good chance of avoiding it. The Terrorist has nothing major that you keep an eye on. However, the next few Eidolons do. The thing to keep in mind in Terrorist, though, is that it has 4 limbs. So you will need 2 Eidolon Lers that are fully charged to capture it. It is additionally recommended that you have at least 1 additional Eidolon Lure fully charged, so that when the Terrorist is captured, you don't have to faff around charging an Eidolon Lure right off the bat when you move to the Gaunt list. The Gaunt list, much like the previous ones, looks the same. It's just bigger with 2 additional limbs, so you'll need 3 Eidolon Lures to capture it, plus 1 extra that you'll want to carry over to the Hydralist later. Now, the Gaunt list is based around spike damage. He has similar abilities in terms of the bolts of lightning, the shots of energy, and a couple of different beams, but the main abilities he has that you want to look out for are the big heavenly beams of light. Every now and again, the Eidolon will stomp the ground, and this is the big telegraph here. Every time the Eidolon stomps the ground, he will cause big beams of light to appear on the floor, which after 2 seconds will then erupt into huge columns of light shooting into the sky. These will kill you in a single second. They will also destroy your Eidolon Lers very, very quickly. So don't stand in the stupid. You can tell when you need to move because the second the Eidolon stomps the ground, you can guarantee that there will be a beam of light under your feet. It will also place them randomly around the area as well. So if you stack up when he stomps the ground, then you can spawn all the beams of light in a single place and then move away from them. The only other ability that the Gauntlet has that is worth noting is the Big Bubble. This is going to be very easy to tell when it happens because it's a giant freaking bubble. Now, if you're outside this bubble, you can't shoot into the bubble. So you need to be within the bubble to deal damage to the Eidolon, which brings you within range of his other damaging abilities. This is also the ability that changes if he starts charging his shields. If the Eidolon charges his shields, then so long as he's tethered to Vombalists, this big bubble will spam over and over again, dealing small amounts of damage every time you're hit by it, and it will only stop once the Vombalists are dead. It's not deadly, it's just very annoying. And finally, good old Harry, good old Hydralist. Whereas the Gauntlet was based around spike damage, the Hydralist is based around damage that ramps up quickly over time. The Hydralist has one main ability that will do damage and one main ability that will just cause you an absolute nightmare. The main ability that does damage is the Lightning. This is a consistent ability that goes throughout the entirety of the fight and gets quicker the more limbs the Eidolon loses. So you'll notice that each lightning bolt will randomly hit around the area and additionally target players directly. Each lightning bolt hits for 300 to 400 lightning damage in a 3-meter radius. So if you think about it, if you stack up, then this lightning is going to stack with you and you're more likely to kill each other. So what you want to do is you want to stay spread, and if somebody dies, then try to let them revive themselves, because if you stack up to revive them, chances are you're going to kill yourself. So you either want to try and spam energy plates, health plates, and just keep yourself alive in this phase, and try and just deal with that electric damage as you go. The final ability, and probably one of the most impactful abilities on these Eidolons, is the Vombalist Bloom, which is only relevant for the Hydralist. The Vombalist Bloom is a purple swirly butthole that will randomly appear around the map. This purple swirly butthole will cause any Vombalist within 20 yards to become completely immune to damage. Which is annoying, because if the Eidolon then decides to recharge his shields, not only do you then have a bunch of immune Vombalists to deal with, but you then have a Vombalist Bloom you also need to kill additionally to that. So you don't need to kill the Vombalist Bloom every time, however, because like a very bad parent who has parenting issues, the Eidolon will naturally abandon the Vombalist Bloom by walking away from it, taking the Vombalists out of the general vicinity of it. Now, this can be a problem, however, because if the Eidolon does recharge his shields within the direct reach of a Vombalist Bloom, one of the Vombalists attached to the Vombalist Bloom will gain an overshield so strong that even Zeus himself would struggle to destroy it. So if a overcharged Vombalist does come along, then you're going to want to get your entire team to focus it down. However, if you have high enough DPS, this might not even happen because the shield recharge is on a timer. And if your DPS is high enough, every time you destroy a limb, that shield recharge timer resets. Sometimes they do randomly cast it just because, but if your DPS is high enough and you're killing the limbs quick enough, you might never see a shield recharge in the first place. It's just if you do, you're going to need to be hot on the mark to get that Vombalist destroyed, otherwise it'll add minutes to the fight. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a remake of the Eidolon guide. I do hope it's been a lot more informative, a little bit more professional looking, and maybe, you know, a bit more informative. If it has, do leave a like, leave comments down below as to the way you kill Eidolon, because I'd love to get your opinions on it. And again, please don't be too elitist with this. We're just trying to help new players here and help people who just want to touch up on their skills with it. We might very well look at doing a more in-depth guide on how to get like 5 sets of 3 Eidolons in a single night, but that would have to be a separate video on of its own. And if you want to join us with these videos, we do record them on Twitch, where we get you involved and we have some fun, we help new players, and we generally have a good community for you all to join in with. So if you feel like joining us, there'll be a link to that down in the description as well. And for any additional information, as well as part 2 to this Eidolon guide and the AMP guide, which all work in synergy together, then links to those will be down below as well. So do go and check them out if you get the chance. And if you haven't subscribed, consider subscribing as well. This video will end soon, I'm sure. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'll see all you top hatters in the next video. Ta-ra!